Look, first, let's start with the positive. First of all, freedoms are gained again. For the first time for the last 50 years or 60 years, if you are a Syrian living in Syria, you close your door in the evening and you will not be attacked by the insecurity forces of your own country and doing things that you cannot even imagine. So this has a huge price tag on it. Getting your freedoms back, getting your rights back. And this is something that Syrians have never even dreamt of. The World Bank statistics say that if you compare the GDP today to Syria, that pre-rebellion or pre-revolution level, it has slashed by 50%. So just to go back to where we were, it's going to take some time. But in the last 2 years, it has improved, I think, by 15 or 20%. So that's not bad at all. Currency depreciation is something from another world. When I left Syria, I used to exchange $1 for like 50 Syrian pounds. Today, $1 is like 12,000, 13,000. You're looking about 25,000%. The currency lost 99.5% of its purchasing value against US dollars.
Najib Al Aswad, welcome to Majlis Markets.
Thank you, Hassan. Great to have you, Akhi.
Najib, you've been actually requested by a lot of people. I did an interview with Farooq Raza a couple of months ago on the Pakistan economy, and a lot of people in the comments were like, yeah, we need to get Najib Al Aswad in the podcast. So I'm really happy that we could make this happen. I know this has been in the works for a while, and I'm really excited to talk to you today. I really want to talk to you today about Syria, what's going on over there, your thoughts on the economy. And I also must point out to the listeners that I have my own story, which I mentioned before on an episode I did with Jihad Yazigi last year, which I'll link in the show notes as well, is that I spent time in Syria myself in 2010, just before the uprisings took place in April 2011. So I definitely have some anecdotal insights into that, but obviously Najib has probably the more like up-to-date stuff. Could you give us like a little background about yourself and where you are now?
Oh, thank you very much, Hassan, for having me. I mean, I'm Syrian. I think that's maybe one of the reasons why you want me to talk about Syria. I also have an interesting story I probably haven't shared publicly before. I left Syria back in 2011 and I couldn't go back home because I was simply, on the list of the wanted individuals by the regime. And it's not because I've done something special. It's most of the, men in certain age group are, required to go for the military service and get engaged in the, murdering of innocent people. So like, hundreds and maybe thousands of young, at that time I was young, I mean, individual. I had to stay away from my country for like 12 years in a row. It was very difficult. Alhamdulillah, we're glad that things now have moved on. And in that time, I called UK home, and UK has been very generous to me. Done my higher education there, studied at Durham University in Islamic finance, and I kicked off my international Islamic finance career from there, where I spent with IFAS close to 13 years working across 50 countries, alhamdulillah, in Islamic finance, working with advisory with governments across the entire sector, subhanAllah, from governments, regulators, policymakers to financial institutions, corporates, NGOs to microfinance, and a little bit of work with the retail side. And then last year I moved on and I had two small boutique companies. One is the IFCAB, Islamic Finance Capacity and Advisory Bureau, which is focused on the advisory and training side. I'm trying to do something different here where I'm focusing on more work with the, I would say, the retail side. Yes, I'm still involved. Like last year, alhamdulillah, I've got some work with Sukuk regulations for a country. I've done some other work in partnership with other companies for like a national roadmap. So I'm still involved in that corporate side and that government advisory side. But I'm doing something different in terms of hopefully contributing in building the next generation of Islamic finance professional. And we launched like public training for the Islamic finance qualification by CISI. I wanted to focus on bringing the industry expertise in that and having guest speakers. And the next adventure is the Sharia Audit Group, what I believe is the world's first professional practice exclusively dedicated to providing independent Sharia audit. And I felt we have a problem in the Islamic finance industry where we have normalized, providing Sharia advice and audit by the same entity to the client where there's clearly a conflict of interest. And even the conventional finance, they try to do things. I know that some companies have done very good work where they have done operational separation, But we really need to take the industry to the next level where we have companies grown to do only external Sharia audit, just like when you have companies doing financial audit. And by the way, even the conventional audit finance entities like KPMG, I think they had like a project called Everest Project in 2023 where they wanted to separate the two, but they couldn't because there was incentives for the partners. You know, when you bring advisory work after the audit. So even if they are operationally separate, the same company is gaining from this. Syria, you know, I've managed, alhamdulillah, to go back there. I was there since the liberation of the country. I've been going there very frequently, trying to engage with the stakeholders and trying to do something meaningful. Nothing yet so far, but trying, inshallah, to do of some sort of contribution.
On your background and where in Syria are you from, Najib?
That's a very good question. So I'm originally from Hama.
Okay.
My family is originally from Hama. I was born and bred in Damascus.
Whereabouts in Damascus? Whereabouts?
Well, it depends. I mean, last time, like in our home today is in Kafar Souseh.
Okay. Yeah. That's a nice area.
You are familiar, yeah, you are
Yes.
familiar of
Yeah.
that.
It's a really nice area,
Yeah.
actually.
So now we live in Kafar Souseh. Now it's become a very interesting area. There's a lot of you know, movement in terms of infrastructure and become a very modern area. Like 20, maybe 25 years ago, it used to be just simply, you know, greeneries and fields.
I think the sports stadium was there, right? Malab Tashrin, isn't it? Not far from there, if I'm
Not
not
too far,
mistaken.
not too far. Yes, you're right. It's like a couple of miles.
And then, so you grew up in the era of Bashar al-Assad. What was it like living in Syria at that time?
You know, I still remember vividly when Hafiz al-Assad died, honestly, and it was so difficult time for everyone. They've done like an entire embargo on everything, and they have done it in a way that people should not even have the time to think of doing anything. They were just afraid of any sort of coup or any attempt or to rebellion. So they banned all civic movement. You have to just stay at your home, and they asked mosques to put some Quran like all day long until they have managed to figure out what to do. And this is where they have looked at the constitution. The constitution says the president has to be 40 years old, but the idiot was like in his 30s at the time. So they have to change the constitution to his size so he can be a president. And they have pulled this off, and people started clapping in the House of you know, let's say Parliament at the time. And he became president. So it was tough. You know, I come from a city, Hama, where Hama in the 90s it was subject to a huge massacre. People don't know this. So I was raised in a household where we were taught what to say and how to say it, and be very careful of how you do and how you speak about things in life. So in the 90s, people who don't know Hafiz al-Assad and his brother, there was some military occupation, not even a military occupation, just a complete genocide of people. They went to tanks inside mosques, and it was really sad. At that time, there was no social media. No people wouldn't even know. Even within Syria, you couldn't know what's going on for quite a long period. So I think estimates between 30 to 50,000 people were murdered at the time for a very small. I mean, relatively speaking, it's the fifth largest city in Syria. But if you compare it to Damascus, it's like a small part of it. So being in that family, being on that, even from my mom's side, you know, we had the same problem. She's also from Hama. So we were brought with that fear, you know, what to say, how to say it. But at the same time, society was very open to each other. So I used to have friends from all different sects, from all different religions. So we grew together in the university, in school. So society did not have a problem of where do you come from, but the regime was trying to capitalize on that area to build that society, but it didn't work out.
And you went to undergraduates in Syria, right?
Yes. So in 2005, I think, one of the things were happening in Syria. They established something called the Higher Institute of Business Administration, and it was a collaboration between European universities and what they used to call the مركز الأبحاث العلمية. So the Center of Scientific Research that used to be under the government. And it was bombarded by the US in the early days. So there was like a collaboration between Center of Scientific Research in Syria and a number of European universities to establish the first higher institute focused on business administration and management, where that was an area of reform, to be honest with you, between 10,000 to like 2000 till 2010. Bashar al-Assad, despite all his sins, he was trying to do things differently, but he was trying, of course, to make sure all his, friends and acquaintances get their hands in everything they do. So they have done this experience where they've studied the first higher institute. So I studied there. I was like the fourth batch in that university where we had like 3 years of bachelor degree where we studied things like business management. Then you focus where I studied like a postgraduate diploma for 2 years, focused on banking and finance. And I was really fascinated by Islamic finance from that early age, where I was looking at, we had no Islamic finance, by the way, at the time. So people don't know the banking and finance system in Syria was mainly government owned and managed until the early 2000s. So the entire financial, like private banking and financial system goes back to like 25 years, right? Forget Islamic, I'm just talking generally. The privatization where they allowed to private banks, it was in the early 2000s. So it was a very high time that we were coming 5 years after that starting. So banks coming from the GCC, Al Baraka Bank, banks from Kuwait, banks from other countries where they started to establish like local bases and so on. So it was very perfect timing. But we had no Islamic finance, very little Islamic finance movement at the time. I think two or three banks started to establish themselves. And this is where I realized I really need to I've learned at that age that, riba or interest is prohibited and I have to find something else to do in my life than going for conventional. So I started to look at my research and studies towards Islamic finance and doing internships before traveling to the UK for studying, at Durham University.
When did you first hear about Islamic finance?
It was 2002, I believe. Second year in the university, we had the first Islamic bank in Syria. I remember it used to be called Sham Bank. And that really was an interesting insight for me. Okay, so there's something called Islamic banking. Alhamdulillah, I was fortunate to have good English at the time. So I started reading about this in English literature. I read about the experience in Malaysia. And that has led me to spending a lot of time in reading and about this sector, start to some comparisons, uh, you know, about what's happening in this financial system and so on. In 2008, we had the establishment of the Damascus Securities Exchange in Syria. What is interesting about this is Syria had a stock exchange in the 90s. Imagine, Hassan, because of this oppressing regime that has messed up the entire, like Syria was really a leader in the region in terms of trade and finance. There was no, because the way Hafiz al-Assad rule is to make sure that we are completely isolated from the international community. We had no mobile phones, by the way. It was prohibited until early 2000s or something. So when Bashar came and allowed international communication companies to come, but then he had to have a share in each and every one of them when they come to the country. But I remember growing up, we only have landlines, where people had, first pagers, if you remember, then cell phones. So we didn't have pagers phase. We went straight from landlines to cell phones. And that was around probably 2000, the area to like 25 years ago, where cell phones have been around for maybe 50, 60 years. So they wanted to monitor all calls locally, internationally. We used to laugh in Syria. We say, whenever you have a call, there is third person listening to the call, especially international calls. Like local calls, maybe you can get away, but international calls, we used to laugh and say, somebody is waiting to pick up the phone, then they will let it ring on the other side. So yeah, and in terms of going back to the question of the banking system, like the establishment of the Securities Exchange, that was very interesting for me. So I read more about it. And then I've done my postgraduate diploma dissertation about the establishment of an Islamic equity index in Syria, which is not established till today, by the way. So I've done like the whole research on it, and then I continued working on this when I came to the UK. I presented this, I remember, to one of the largest investment banks in the country. And after working with them for some time, they said, sorry, we can't do this, because if we say for our customers that we are not Sharia compliant, they will not invest in our own stock. But we really like the idea.
And then when did Durham come into all of this? Why did you decide to go to Durham University?
So in 2011, I was, to be honest with you, involved in the civic movement, going to mosques and then people chanting afterwards, we want some extra freedoms and so on. And so my dad was really worried about me, rahimahullah. So I really had ambitions to study abroad and continue further my studies. So I'd done some research online. I found there were like 5 or 6 universities at the time that do Islamic finance, postgraduate diploma, and Durham was one of them. But it seemed to be a difficult grab because it was in the top 5. It wasn't easy. So at the time, because Syria was starting to get some sanctions, even we had no place to do an IELTS test. So I had to travel to Beirut to do a test and come back. So it was really the reputation of the university and the fact that you only have 5 options anyway. So without the 5 options, He was looking the best option. I've looked at that time for Professor Mehmet Asutai. I've read about him and Professor Habib Ahmad, who are dear mentors and teachers of me from that time till today. And subhanallah, I made the application. I met the requirements of English and everything. And even my postgraduate studies, I had like excellence. In Syria, they had imtiyaz. So their minimum requirement was actually imtiyaz for Syria. I thought like I'm applying, I must get it. But then learned later on that it has to be at least this level. But after all of this effort, they told me you need to come because you have not done research in English. You need to come and do a 2-week course to make sure that you know how to do research before you get yourself into the master's degree. And if you don't pass, you have to submit like in every week one research paper about a topic you don't know and about a topic you choose. And if you don't get like B minimum, you will not get the master's degree. So they were very strict. So I went for it. Alhamdulillah, it worked out. I've done the master's degree at Durham University, and it was very a beautiful experience as well.
Amazing. If we just stick on Syria for a second, what were your initial thoughts when the fall of Bashar al-Assad was done in November, December 2024?
I couldn't believe it, honestly, Hassan. You know, wallahi, I couldn't believe it. You know, we were on a high, we were almost accepting that we have to live with this guy. So we reached a point where we have really lost, our trust, subhanAllah, in Allah, astaghfirullah. Like, we thought, this guy is going to stick. But suddenly this thing happened in the north. But what we don't know is that this has been being built for the last 10 years. So what the regime has done is taken all the rebel groups from different cities. So they had a plan where, look, let's start to clean up city by city, and we have an agreement with these rebels. We will take you and put you in Idlib, right? In that part of in that province of Syria, and you live there on your own. We will not touch you. So they all knew at one point when the regime will get their power back, they will come to them. So they were grouping and getting city after city as they got the rebels around Damascus suburbs, Homs suburbs, Hama suburbs. They put them all in one place. So these guys first had started to fight between them, which is very sad. But they suddenly realized if we don't get together and work together, it will not be difficult. So over the years while the regime was grouping and consolidating, they have also done the same. So they have consolidated themselves and strengthened themselves. And it's very clear that they had some links to Turkey and other countries who are supporting them. But it was very minimal support because Russia was highly involved in Syria. Iran was highly involved in Syria. Hezbollah to a certain level was highly involved in Syria, but then Hezbollah got involved with Israel, so they withdrawn from Syria. Iran got involved with other issues, so they were withdrawn from the country, and Russia was heavily involved in Ukraine. So the international scene looked at if the region don't have the air superiority, maybe we can give it a shot. So these guys gave it a shot, and it went from a plan of they had a plan of 6 months or 1 year. It happened like 2 days. So it shows you the fragility of the military, the Syrian military, because these people were hungry, they were deprived, and they were mainly relying on the support from the Russians whenever they needed, especially from aerial superiority as well. So yeah, it was absolutely overwhelming. I remember at that time I couldn't sleep, and then when I slept for 2 hours, I wake up. I've been told that Bashar has left the country.
So when the tanks rolled into Damascus and Ahmad al-Sharaa, along with the others, rolled into Damascus, I guess like you didn't think that you had no idea that this was going to take place in such a short amount of time, right?
No way, no way. My mom was actually in Hama at the time, and it was like I don't know whether it's 2 day or 1 day battle. So when we used to speak to her, we can hear the sounds of the armory and shells and all of it. And we were thinking if that's happening in Hama, which is way far, for like 200 kilometers from Damascus, how is it going to be in Damascus? But there was nothing in Damascus. It was just a straight walk. So when they went in Damascus, people were just finding the military clothes thrown on the floor. These guys have just left their stations and run away. And one of the tactics that we've learned later on, what these guys have done is, there was one area between the Syrian army and the rebels at the time where they had a lot of landmines. So what they used to do every night, they will send some of their, the rebels sent some of their team. They will, basically disable them and come back. So they came from that side where they would not expect them. And what they have done, they have managed to strike the leaders. So when the leaders got killed, people freaked out. They did not know how to get instructions, and they did not have a decentralized infrastructure where if somebody fails, you have someone else, and so on and so forth. So when the leaders are not there, things have been messed up, and Bashar fled even before things become really serious.
Since Ahmad al-Sharaa and other groups have taken over Syria, and now the leaders of the country, it's safe to say that, or it's easy to say that it hasn't been easy for Syria since liberating from Bashar al-Assad's regime, and there's a lot of legacy and excess baggage, whether that be political
Absolutely.
or economic. And it seems like Syria now has to rebuild, and it's only been not even 2 years since this has happened. I mean, from your perspective, how do you assess, or rather, or how do you evaluate what's happened so far from an economic perspective?
I mean, look, first, let's start with the positive. First of all, freedoms are gained again. For the first time for the last 50 years or 60 years, if you are a Syrian living in Syria, you close your door in the evening and you will not be attacked by the insecurity forces of your own country and doing things that you cannot even imagine. So this has a huge price tag on it. Getting your freedoms back, getting your rights back. And this is something that Syrians have never even dreamt of. Yeah, I mean, this is really a treasure. It saved us. Look what happened with Iraq, with Libya. Yes, Syria has been destroyed, and we'll talk about more of the economic sides. But on the positive side, there is still a lot of positivism about the future outlook. Building institutions is happening very slow but steady. Syria is coming back to the world map. As you mentioned, President was yesterday in London. Before he was in Germany. He met with Trump. One of the biggest wins as well is the removal of the US and European Union blanket sanctions. So there was blanket sanctions on anything has to do with Syria. But of course, there are still, maybe we'll talk about this later on, of the challenges. But that's also a very important, achievement. One of the interesting things that has happened as well is the issuance of a new currency. So as you can imagine, with the old regime and the forgery of old currencies, and Syria is a cash economy at the end of the day, is largely cash economy. So they had to issue a new currency to make sure that the old currency slowly goes out of the system and they can know how much they have and how much they can use. So that has been also a good achievement in that short time. There's a lot of plans for financial reformation, billions of investments promised by GCC and other countries. Now, that's the positive side. Of course, economy has a long way to recover. We have to be realistic. I mean, look, the World Bank statistics say that if you compare the GDP today to Syria, that pre-rebellion or pre-revolution level, it has slashed by 50%. So just to go back to where we were, it's going to take some time. But in the last 2 years, it has improved, I think, by 15 or 20%. So that's not bad at all. Currency depreciation is something from another world. When I left Syria, I used to exchange $1 for like 50 Syrian pounds. Today, $1 is like 12,000, 13,000. You're looking about 25,000%, depreciation. So sort of the currency lost 99.5% of its purchasing value against US dollars. So you can imagine, Hassan, what can this do to a country? And then there was a recent report by the World Bank estimating just the reconstruction needs for Syria is around 216 billion. So I mean, in summary, the real shift has happened in terms of diplomacy, financial reentry, sanction relief, but the country, still faces a lot of destroyed capital base, weak state capacity, fragile institutions, and there's of course a big trust deficit in terms of the banking and the governance. But these are work in progress.
Yeah, I remember Najib, when I was living there in August 2010, and I tried to receive money from my father. I had to go to a Western Union because the Western banks were very limited in Syria. And I remember going, I think it was Muhajirin, near the central bank of Damascus, the
Mm.
area, and this was one of the few places where you could actually do international money exchange. And I went there, and I gave my details and credentials and everything, and the tracking number that my father had sent. And it was only like maybe $100 or $200, very small amount,
Mm.
you think. But then when the cashier, she came back, she went to the back of the office, and then she came with like 4 or 5 like bags of notes, and I'm like, oh, this is a lot. So yeah, you're right. It's like The inflation, even in 2010, was still quite high, right? And the conversion was still quite a lot. And, having to carry this in the middle of Damascus, like, bags of money, even though it was only maybe like $100 worth of notes. So, yeah, no, I can definitely relate to what you were saying about in those
Yeah.
days of Assad and how, repressive it was. Even as a foreigner living there myself, it was quite a repressive regime. And now that the country's been, new rulers are ruling it, but like I said, it hasn't been easy. And like you said, like they've tried a lot, they've tried to do a lot. It's only been not even 2 years, and there's a lot of reconstruction. But even from like a security perspective, it's still quite precarious there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of security situation in central cities, it is reasonably okay. What is still not great is when you go in the suburbs area. But to be honest with you, one thing, Hassan, that people sometimes miss seeing is in the days of the regime, there was no freedom to talk about things. For example, God forbid you have a relative being kidnapped. Now you go and say social media and say, "Oh, my cousin has been kidnapped." The security forces will not come to you. But at that time, they will tell you, do not say anything, Even if they bring a dead body to you, or a relative or whatever, they say, just do the janaza, don't say anything to anyone, or we were going to make you, follow this guy who passed away. So they wanted to suppress the statistics, and there is very low crime rate and so on. But now we have a different story. Don't also forget now we have reformation of these, informal groups into a normal military of a government, and they opened the door for new people to come and join the military. There were some rumors that only Muslim Sunnis were allowed, which is not correct. There was an interview with a Christian guy who was but of course they have introduced some elements of Islamic theology. Remember when you build an army, people have certain belief or faith. You can use that belief or faith to motivate them. So they added some religious modules as well in training them. But yes, it will take time to build that security back and get things in place. And with Israel also bombarding Damascus and Syria every now and then, I think when they have recaptured also parts of Syria, by the way, in the early phase. So it's not easy to manage all of this at the same point.
Yeah, politically, it's quite interesting, right? Because Ahmad Sharaa has his own story, and being part of
Yes.
first Al Qaeda and then Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and from a guy who was a wanted terrorist by the United States and other Western governments to
Mm.
being now, president of the country. I think a movie will eventually be made about that, or documentaries will be made about that. And I think there's been books written about him. And, it's been quite interesting to the sense that I think Turkey's put a lot of political capital or political support behind him.
Yes.
Countries like Saudi Arabia as well. Mohammed bin Salman was very influential in introducing Ahmad Sharaa to Donald Trump, and it seemed like Donald Trump seems to like a tough guy, and Ahmad Sharaa is definitely a tough guy. But like there is like, if we're being very frank as well, Najib, there's a lot of criticism against him inside Syria, right? Like
Of
how he's handled
course.
things.
Yes. See, this is the beauty of enabling people to speak now. People can criticize, and it's healthy to have. Back I couldn't have this conversation with you, Hassan. If Bashar al-Assad was in the country, I'll just say, Habibi, just ask me about GDP, employment. That's it. But now I can tell you clearly, there's a lot of criticism. I mean, and it's in many cases it's valid criticism. Whether it's who's getting the top jobs, who's getting to lead with certain areas. And you have to differentiate, Hassan, between two different phases. Phase of, let's say formation and phase of normalization. In the phase of formation, when you have a higher risk of military coup, you need to put the people you trust, even if they don't have the best skills on that job, right? And for me, this could be up to 5 years. Even with that, to be honest with you, now he has introduced like the governor of the central bank. He has nothing to do with them and their groups. He's completely comes from a financial background. He studied at Durham University, by the way, and he worked with the big four and so on. The minister of finance, same story. The Minister of Economy, Nidal al-Sha'ar, who used to be an IOFI secretary, he is now the Minister of Economy. So he doesn't come from that background. But in that 6 month to 1 year, he had only the people he knew and he worked with in Idlib. But so he started to give that sensitive areas to people who have the background, the expertise, and that's one of the criticisms. And we will definitely see a lot of teething issues and problems. And I don't think if you are working in that environment, you will not be making mistakes. So yes, there are a lot of issues that needs to be fixed. And to be honest with you, I would probably look at this after 5 years and say whether they have really made a change or not. But so far, what they say and what they do seems to be, generally positive. I mean, when you are living in the country struggling economically, of course you will have a different view than me. And that's why I engage with people always when I travel. And there's still issues of, the recovery. I mean, one of the biggest challenges, to be honest with you, is energy. So, energy is the cornerstone of the economy, and we still have problem with electricity. We have problem with, petrol and gas and oil. So partly because north of Syria was captured by forgot the name of the Kurdish.
SDF, Syrian
Yes,
Democratic.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, by the SDF. So most of the natural resources of Syria was captured by them. I think recently it has been resolved. This issue has been resolved, but it will take some time until you fix that. Syria at one point had self-sufficiency, so we had no deficit for other countries and debt. So we hope and pray, inshallah, things will come up. So that's one of the biggest challenges is really energy. Now they try to resolve this with the GCC, but with the current situation, it become really worse. And you can imagine now with the aggression in the Middle East and what's happening in Iran and Israel just bombarding every country in the region. So the situation has become really bad, and that affects everything. It's like uh, a dominoes chain. When you hit electricity or petrol, everything goes up.
The article I wrote last year, Najib, on whether Islamic finance can play a role in Syria's recovery, it got a lot of fanfare. Actually, I think it got a lot of traction with inside Syria, not just because you were quoted in the article and other people as well, like very well-known people. I mean, Islamic finance, as you've alluded to, or as you've said in the past, it was there in Syria, and it's been coming in the last 25 years. I remember writing an article in 2010 for my essay at Damascus University, writing about Syria's status as the WTO. And you can talk about Syria International Bank. You could talk about Al Baraka. Sham Bank, of course, is there. I think BSF as well had a joint venture with BSF from Saudi Arabia had a joint venture with a local player in Syria. So there are opportunities for Islamic finance in this new era of Syria, right?
Absolutely. Hassan, when we talk about Islamic finance, we take a step back and look at finance and the economy generally. So I think I mentioned the entire privatization of banking is 25 years old. So if you take that into account, I remember vividly when this started, all the banks started to effectively import managers from other countries. So most of the banks, you will see them, managed by a Jordanian, a Lebanese in the early days, because we used to have like 12 banks in the country, all state owned. Yes, there were Syrian managers, but they did not want these state owned banks who were used to very slow and some of them didn't even have core banking system. Imagine they just used to write things on papers and file them and folder them. So it was really the state-owned banking system was very bad. So the entire experience is very young, 25 years, and then the Islamic banking was allowed later on. So the conventional banking had the advantage of being first. And I think the first bank, the private bank, was Bank Bemo. You mentioned it was a partnership actually between the Lebanese Bank Bemo, I think, and Saudi Faransi in Saudi, and they established like Bank Bemo Saudi Faransi BSF. I remember doing an internship with them at the time. So they managed to capture a huge market share just because they were the first to enter the country. So even with that, I think today we have 4 or 5 full-fledged Islamic banks. One important point is Islamic windows is prohibited. They're still prohibited. There were before the new governor came in, there was an interim governor who made the legislation ready. It will always be approved, but the new governor seems to have put that window piece on hold. So I think opening up Islamic window is going to be a big change for the industry. But going back to the main issues, first of all, you have a cash economy. So people just are used to use cash. And this goes back to the concept of lack of trust. Remember when the government was involved in everything? Look what happened in Lebanon as well, which is very sad to see. Because I remember when I was young, my dad rahimahullah, used to travel to Lebanon to do like a letter of credit so he can get, like a shipment from abroad for international trade and so on. He wasn't available in Syria. He would go and travel to Lebanon, do it and come back. So we don't have the trust. Lebanon at the time, we used to be the Switzerland of the Middle East. Everyone trusted the financial system. So people don't trust the financial system. They don't trust the government. So I hear from my father and his friend that the best money in Syria is the money under your mattress. You cannot put it in a bank. And this still carries on till today, to be honest with you, especially when there was change of the regime. People were panicking and trying to withdraw money. So the governor, the interim governor at the time, put some thresholds and limits. So that even exaggerated people. And I can understand that from his perspective or her perspective. But that, eroded the trust even further. So trust was an issue. Currency was an issue that has been resolved recently. I mean, linkages to financial infrastructure is a big problem as well. So yes, the global sanctions, the blanket sanctions have been removed, but we have sanctions related to individuals, right? Which are involved with the Al Assad activities. What is interesting is these guys were infiltrating the entire financial system, Islamic and non Islamic. So you may see them in shareholding, in board of directors. So at one point, there was not a single bank was able to do a transaction because forget the sanctions. We need to get these guys off our records. And it's not easy. Some of them are already fled in Russia. Some of them are in people don't know where they are. So you cannot just scratch someone's share and give it to someone else. So there was a lot of, there's a lot of effort now for the entire financial system, consolidation, capitalization, capitalization, whatever you want to call it. I think the governor has given all banks around 6 months to come up with a plan to fix this issue. Another major problem, Hassan, was the government and was not only involved in shareholding, but they were getting a lot of loans from these institutions and financing, and they were all unpaid, most of them. So there was a high non-performing loans and financing in their books, Islamic and conventional, which led now to entire financial system being very fragile. Another thing that they need to look at and learn from. So the first phase really is getting the stabilization, the currency, the banking, the payments, electricity, public finance. Then probably we talk about the second phase of products and SMEs and working capital and all of this. So there is a lot of good work on that that is happening. And Islamic finance naturally can boost this. I mean, Syria is a Muslim majority country, so it will help in boosting financial inclusion. It will help in bringing foreign direct investment, especially from the GCC and other countries. Infrastructure is always something linked to Islamic finance and mobilizing idle funds. What is interesting as well, the Central Bank of Syria has established a center of excellence for Islamic finance under its own organizational structure, which signals a strong political will to support the sector. I think their official status as a central bank, they said that we want to like leave a equal distance between conventional Islamic, so there is no positive discrimination, if you want. Establishing that center of excellence definitely shows there is positive signals. The Minister of Finance also recently announced that they're planning to launch Sukuk, which is Sharia compliant alternative to bonds, and they haven't talked about bonds yet. So that means also the government seems to be looking at Sukuk as a way of providing funding for the government. So overall, you can see there are a lot of positive signs that Islamic finance can and should, inshallah, play a role. But we have to fix the issue of trust and consumer awareness, which is a major obstacle.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I remember back in 2010, 2011, the idea, like, when I got talking to some people in Damascus, putting money in the bank account in the Syrian bank was quite a new thing in
Yeah.
the private banks. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Najib, is, Ahmad al Sharaa and the people who are backing him come from a more conservative background, let's put it that way. Would you say that Syria, there was a lot of talk saying that Syria would go down the path of Afghanistan in terms of like it would completely outlaw riba or any kind of conventional banking, but it doesn't seem like they're going that way. Do you think that they will go down this way, or do you think they're taking a more pragmatic approach?
The nature of the Afghani community and society is different than the Syrian society. So that's something has to be taken into account. When you think of Afghanistan, there's a lot of tribes, sort of unified Muslim, I would say, yeah, majorities, they have very uniformity among them as a society. So forget Taliban. But in Syria, we don't have the same. Yes, we have a majority of Muslim Sunni, but we have also significant Shia, we have significant Christian community, we have Jews and others. So complete out ban, I don't think is going to happen, but it's going to, if the infrastructure is done in enabling a level playing field, Islamic finance is going to be naturally measured by market demand. And I think this is where they are heading. They are not going to, so far they haven't even allowed Islamic windows. So think about it like this, Hassan. If they had what you said, they probably would at least allow windows because that's a good way of minimizing conventional finance. But they haven't done that step. So yes, my own estimation of that, and based on what they are, making in terms of announcements and so on, that they don't. It's not going to happen. At least in the near future. I mean, if you reach a point where Islamic finance is like 95% of the entire financial system naturally, organically, there is no point of trying to remove laws and remove things. But I think the appeal for the government now to look into Sukuk is more of trying to get something like asset backed, have more of investment features than debt. And this is one of their, I've heard a lot Ahmad Sharaa, the president, talking about different things. But one thing he repeatedly said, I do not want the country to fall into the trap of debt and we lose our sovereignty over time. So far they have been very careful in going for investments and equity and long term. But at the same time, this approach, to be honest with you, has meant they don't have short-term funding to extinguishing the needs of people. So probably Sukuk is going to fill that part. Maybe they get a little bit of balance of some debt through international Sukuk and trying to lead into that area.
The last AAOIFI conference in 2024, I got talking to a gentleman from the Central Bank of Afghanistan, and he was talking to me about like how great everything is and how Islamic everything is. But then when I asked him, "Oh, you're going to like the IMF or somebody like that for money," his response to me was, "Well, I've got commodities to buy. I have to trade in the international market, and obviously that's all done in conventional finance. So it's also about being a global citizen as well, right? That plays a role in the reality."
To be honest with you, Hassan, I mean, this is all about systemic importance, and maybe that's what Islamic finance has to achieve. In countries where Islamic finance has achieved systemic importance, I think according to the IMF, it's 15% percentage. Once you exceed that, then you can push for change. So I mean, I'm not a big fan of the IMF loans anyway. We all know when you have a loan in a different currency, that you're always depreciating against, when they get involved in your policy decisions and put restrictions on your fiscal and monetary policies, you lose some of your sovereignty for that, and you just start running to pay interest. You add interest on top of inflation rate, you end up like in endless shackles of debt. So I'm not a big fan of that. But if the realities for some countries where they need to do this, I'm sure when you have enough countries that are accessing IMF, they may structure for them something that fits out at least the formal requirements of Sharia, to arrange. And I know there were some attempts. IMF has partnered with the uh, Financial Services, Islamic Financial Services Board, IFSB in Malaysia, which is a standard setting body, as you know. So they partnered together and established, the IMF does something called financial assessment program, if my memory is not failing me, where they look at the financial system and do like an assessment. And one of the components now, with in partnership with the IFSB, if Islamic finance is systemically important, they will start looking at things like regulations for investment deposits. They will look at things like Sharia governance. So imagine IMF going to a country and saying you should have Sharia governance regulations because you have more than 15%, and this is Sharia non-compliance risk, which can create systemic issues. So there was some positive steps in terms of in that part, at least.
But obviously, the other big thing is that being connected to the international financial system, so things like SWIFT, allowing MasterCard to come in and other financial infrastructure, global infrastructure players to come in within the finance industry is quite important as well in the recovery process, right?
That's something very important you mentioned, Hassan, because I think not if I'm not if I remember correctly, very recently the central bank also has signed an agreement with Visa, if I'm not mistaken, Visa, and they have announced that it will be soon entering Syria. I think it was, yes, Visa. Last year it was in December. Visa announced that they have like a strategic roadmap with the central bank. This is the problem with these headlines, like strategic roadmap. It's not happening today. So with the Central Bank of Syria to help build the digital payments ecosystem. Now, one interesting thing is also about fintech in Syria. There was some attempts to make at least some digital payments in Syria. There was a couple of fintechs. One of them used to be called Fatura, which was mainly owned by Al Aswad and his gang. So I don't know what they are doing it with it, but fintech is definitely also playing a role in that change.
One thing that I'm surprised hasn't been talked about too much is that when Ahmad al-Sharaa came into Damascus, a lot of people were cheering on the fact that Bitcoin could be use of currency in Syria, and you've talked about the stabilization of the currency, but it seems to have gone quiet now. Why do you think that is?
I think Ahmad al himself, he had some interesting ideas about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and he talked positively about it. However, with the I remember reading that the Syrian central bank warned against dealing in digital currencies back in 2025. As of today, there is no like regulatory framework for it, so it doesn't seem to be completely prohibited by this sort of against the use of it. To be honest with you, I can understand as well. You don't even have a basic payment system yet. If you get a Bitcoin, how on earth are you going to cash it? Unless you have somebody who's going to accept the cash for it. So I think it's too early conversation. Ahmad al-Shara did, the president had some ideas about it, but the governor has to make that decision at this point of time. And there is no really clear policy except that warning that went in the media back in 2025.
Yeah, even things like stablecoin, right, which is not necessarily
Yeah.
like a cryptocurrency per se.
Yeah,
But
USDT, and yeah.
yeah, something like this, right? Like it's just digital money, but they seem to have not talked about this too much. The other thing I was going to say is I was watching a YouTube vlogger, a travel vlogger from Australia, and he was using his Revolut account in Old Damascus at one of the hotels there because he didn't have any cash on him at the time, and his bank card wouldn't work in the ATMs. So he tried to use his Revolut account. I think they managed to use his Revolut account to pay for
Whoa,
his stay. Yeah. So
that is actually very impressive if they manage to do that. I will be very impressed, to be honest with you.
yeah, so definitely there's I think there's more digital payments coming in, but the other, and you've talked
Yeah.
a lot about trust. So the one thing that just came to my mind is that there's a lot of entrepreneurs in Syria. I got that a lot when I was in there in 2010, 2011. A lot of entrepreneurship. So are you saying that for the startup ecosystem, when it does come, and entrepreneurs, even like a very simple startup, a very simple business, rather, Islamic finance can help bridge this gap?
I don't think today, like the formal financial system is far away from that. Banks and financial institutions. I think you probably see this in the NBFIs. It's more likely to see it. So now I know there is a wave of leasing companies and small finance companies that is entering the market. So this is what I would expect, but I don't expect, to be honest with you. You may see some corporate finance, but SMEs, look, Hassan, we have to be realistic. A more developed market like UK, we still struggle with this. So in Syria, I doubt we will see anything meaningful for SMEs from the formal financial systems. But MBFIs definitely, especially leasing companies, I do expect this to be happening. And to be honest with you, there is a lot of also movement in terms of having incubators of SMEs, even in the before the liberation of the country. So, as you rightly mentioned, it was informal, but now the youngsters are coming up with proper infrastructure for this and hubs for building talent and co-working spaces. One of the main challenges, again, I probably forgot to talk about is internet. We still have a major issue with internet. It's getting improved. I think recently there was an announcement that STC from Saudi Arabia is joining the market. So hopefully that will help in fixing the internet issue. But it's infrastructure, broadband and fiber optic. It will take a lot of time to be established anyway. At least we are hoping we'll get the cell phone, the internet and 3G or 4G through cell phone is going to resolve this gap for now.
So you don't see Elon Musk providing Starlink to Syria uh, to use for high
I
speed.
hope I hope not. I hope not, because he's probably going to use that data and send it to his friends, and so I hope not.
The one other thing, just sticking on Islamic finance in Syria, is that Syria obviously rejoined the Islamic Development Bank, and you're seeing a lot of Gulf support for Syria, political.
Mm,
Definitely there, but economic has been trickling in. You've had some deals done in I think the ports of
mm.
Latakia. There was some DP World's done some stuff, and other entities like you mentioned, STC. How important is Gulf involvement here, or even if you want to say Islamic involvement from other countries in this?
It is critical, actually. It's not only important. To be honest with you, when I go online and see any video of the president talking about anything, and you just scroll through the comment, Hassan, and you'll just see comments from all around the Muslim world saying, we're happy, we're hoping that this is going to be positive step for Syria. So at societies, at communities level, there's a lot of enthusiasm and positivism for change in Syria. On realistic side, I think Qatar and Turkey were the first ones to come on ground. In fact, I think Emir of Qatar was the first head of state to come to Syria after the liberation. He came very early. So Qatar and Turkey were the first one to join, and then Saudi Arabia joined later on with the rest of the regional countries. So they want, even in the days of Bashar al-Assad, they were highly involved. And as you rightly mentioned, the IDB reinstatement. So by the way, Syria was not part of IDB. Not it was part of IDB, but their membership was removed in the conflict time where Bashar al-Assad was really murdering Syrians left, right, and center. But it was restored in March 2025. So that was a positive move of change. We're hoping also to see the Asian Development Bank, Syria having a membership in the Asian Development Bank also. So they don't have today, which is very interesting. A country like the UK, they have a membership in the Asian Development Bank, but Syria doesn't have while being in Asia. So it's critical. We're the biggest. I think the recent also was a contract signed for instance, the airport. Not re-establishment to be honest with you, just a new proper airport in Damascus. It was also a partnership between a Qatari company and a Turkish company. So there is high hopes, and they expect it to. They play a big role in the redevelopment of Syria. And it's envisioned and pushed by the government through, foreign direct investments and equity investments. They call these projects PPP, and all these type of arrangements where you build, operate, and then transfer the BOT system as well over a number of 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and the Syrian government have to do this in an environment right now where there's a lot of geopolitical tension in the region. You know what's happening with Iran and what's happening next door in Lebanon. So it's a very critical time.
It is absolutely, Hassan. And if you look at, I was speaking to some relatives a few days ago, and they told me they can see, missiles going over Damascus, and sometimes the defense. So some of the battle happens on the skies of Syria, like the defense system try to catch them before they reach Israel as well. So Syria is still getting affected by that. I've heard also a joke that Syria, interestingly, is one of the, relatively speaking, peaceful countries today in the Middle East. If you look what's happening around across the Middle East, it's probably one of the very few times where in the Middle East, Syria is one of the most peaceful countries.
Yeah, it's quite ironic. I just want to shift gear, Najib. You've been very involved in Islamic finance with IFAS and now with your new ventures. And and in this talk about Syria, you've mentioned about trust. There's a lot of distrust in the industry. Where do you think this stems from?
Is this it's a good question, Hassan? But are we talking about globally, or are we talking about country specific,
Well,
market specific?
like I've traveled to Malaysia, I've traveled to the Middle East, I've traveled to Europe, US, and whenever I write about Islamic finance, most people who are not involved in the industry will just groan and saying, it's just the same as conventional, mainly from the retail side. I would say that a lot of them, I think the ones who are bankers and people who are practitioners, they understand that it's quite difficult to be adhering to Sharia ideals. But why do you think like a lot of people get disappointed with Islamic finance?
You see, if I look at markets like, for instance, Saudi Arabia or Malaysia, the market, I think in Saudi Arabia is like 70, 80% market share. So for me, that is not an indication of disappointment. Maybe you are disappointed that the level of service, but you feel that you have to choose this because it's the only halal option. Maybe that's something we cannot see in the figures. If you go to markets like Malaysia, 50, 60%, I think, in banking, and a lot of non-Muslims as well, like Chinese, are using the financial sector for certain financial features. So it's not like one size fits all question, but generally speaking, I can get the feeling of it. And probably one of the key reasons is the expectations. So when we approach Islamic finance, we approach it as we need to see some kind of a creature from a completely different world. Okay, so it has to give us completely different results. It has to be, maybe I think Islamic finance, when it was called Islamic finance, it has been given a very high expectation that whatever you do, you not be able to fulfill. So that's probably where the main reasons start with expectation in my view. So yes, Islamic finance is struggling. There's a lot of challenges. We can talk about ecosystem challenges. It starts from when the Muslim countries start to get independence from colonization states. What happened is all these countries have inherited financial systems. They have inherited central banks. They have inherited payment systems, even, government-owned banks. They work in a certain way. So at that point, Sharia scholars had two options. We start with what we have and start to, fixing and changing and amending, or we just destroy everything and start from scratch, but we don't know where to start. So it wasn't only Sharia scholar, it was an economic question, it was a if you want a financial question, a strategic question. So all countries decide, no, there is no point of destroying and building. So let's start with what we have. And that was, you immediately put yourself in certain constraints and certain ways of doing it, especially with banking. So, eventually when the customer have certain expectation, the shareholders have certain expectations, the regulators have certain expectations. And if you need to meet the expectations of everyone, you will end up in something similar. It is invariable because you started with the expectation. So when I go speak with a bank or set up an Islamic window, they tell me, look, I have these customers who want to buy, for instance, a property in London. They want to have like fixed payments. I don't want to have the headache of increasing payments because there is depreciation in the value, right? So the expectation of the customer is something debt-like. Then you have the shareholders. I don't want to have too much risk. I want this, and that. The bankers, look, I want to focus on uh, on my own capabilities, my core banking system, the people, how they understand it. And you end up building products that fulfill the expectations of everyone. Now, you see that change in the end, not NBFIs, the Islamic fintechs, because they start with different expectations. They are out of the banking, so you don't have the expectations of the regulators. You got that off your back. The shareholders, they come and they know that's high risk venture, right? So we're doing something in the fintech side. There is possibility of very good upside, but at the same time, and they start with sometimes with things that customer don't even know. Think of things like crowdfunding. It wasn't even there. So you start with complete innovation from unknown products, and that helps in creating this. What is important for people to realize always, reaching the similar result doesn't mean this is something haram or halal. So a lot of things in Sharia has to do with the contracts you have used, the process you have used. So you can eat halal and haram chicken taste exactly the same if they are cooked by the same chef, but one is halal and one is haram. I know this is a classical classical example. People got bored of it, but it's the reality. It's mentioned in the Quran. Allah has permitted trade and prohibited riba. And people say like trade is like riba, but they are not the same. If I sell you something on credit and I give you a loan with interest, I may reach a similar economic outcome in 6 months, but they are not the same. If you go the nitty-gritty details about dealing with late payments, dealing with early payments, the importance of having an asset. So if think of conventional finance, you can print as much money as you like. If there is no assets to back them, and you can loan them. But if you just think of sale-based transaction, you have to have enough assets to do these sale transactions. So even at economic level, if everyone uses Islamic finance today, there is constraint by the assets, the goods, the services, and so on. I know I went a lot, but people have to keep that balance in place. And at the same side, to be, pragmatic, conventional finance and Islamic finance, especially Islamic banking, they have been very stagnant in their ways of doing things. And I believe one of our biggest issues is commodity murabaha. When you use commodity murabaha, you can actually kill every principle Islamic finance stands for. Right? And here, I'm not talking about halal or haram. So people don't get me wrong. I accept the AAOIFI view. AAOIFI doesn't say it's haram. It says it's allowed, but subject to certain conditions. And in most times, they are not practiced. So one of the key conditions AAOIFI says it should be a necessity product. It shouldn't be a standard product. So when you have legal issues, regulatory issues, taxation issues, this is where you use commodity murabaha. But if you make commodity murabaha the product, you kill every principle Islamic finance stands for. Because, ethical finance, for example, we say in Islamic finance, we need to know where the money is going. I can use commodity murabaha to give money to a conventional bank, and then the conventional bank will use it interest-bearing activities, right? If there is no control on where the money will be used, I can just say, I sold you a phone, and then you give me the money, and then you go and sell the phone and buy it. I'm not responsible what you do with the money, but I know you are a conventional bank. So the principle where you said I only use money in halal and ethical activities, you can kill it with commodity murabaha. Another principle: if somebody is late, you cannot increase their the money. You cannot increase the debt. You can roll over the commodity murabaha. If you allow this as a Sharia scholar, you kill that principle. So if you think about it deeply, commodity murabaha has the ability to destroy everything that Islamic finance stands for. And you leave very little room for anything that makes you stand out, besides sleeping at rest that you are not doing something haram, which at least according to the Organization of Islamic Fiqh Academy, they prohibited commodity murabaha in the way it's practiced today. So this is like the biggest ijma' body. Having said that, as I said, there are situations where you have or you can use commodity murabaha, especially when you are trying to enter a new market. and with constraints and controls.
AAOIFI Sharia Standard 62 kind of goes to the heart of what you were talking about just now, but there's been such a lot of pushback against it, especially in the financial media, in the banking community, the legal community. A lot of people have an opinion on it. Majority, I think there was a study done by Standard Chartered saying only like 30% of people who were surveyed within the industry actually supported Sharia Standard 62 from AOFI. Why do you think there's been such a pushback towards it?
First reason, in my view, is lack of understanding. 90%, and this is a random percentage I came up with now, but 90% of the people who are commenting on it haven't read it end to end in detail. I remember I was in a conference in London and somebody was saying Sukuk standard, and this is a leader, a guy who is a leader in one of the, I'm not going to name the institution. He calls, this new standard will kill debt like where everyone
I was with
expected,
you there. Yeah. I was with you.
right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I raised my hand and said, this is not true. This is factually not true, right? So the biggest problem is what happened is you have certain institutions which are influential and mainly credit rating institutions. So they were very quick in making reports about how this is going to affect. Look, credit rating is hugely influential in the game of Sukuk, right? So when they made their own opinion and they published this, you immediately influence the entire market. So, and them and other people, we have to remember as well, Sukuk on the conventional side, on the buying side and the selling side is mainly institutions which are conventional. That is not wrong, by the way. Like people think, oh, but they have an influence on it, right? And they will be influenced by credit rating institutions, and they will be influenced by people who are coming and analyzing and so on. So I think first and foremost is perception and understanding this. In my view, if you have read that IOFI standard, first of all, it allows Sukuk in nature, so people get confused by it. Sukuk allows you to have debt-based outcomes, equity and equity-based outcomes, regardless how you structure it, right? And unfortunately, we have some extremist views in the industry where somebody says Islamic finance only profit sharing, somebody says Islamic finance can be only debt based, but the reality is, Islam is a religion of moderation. So we have a mix of contracts that you can use to achieve the desired outcome. So if one of these financial institutions want to carry on doing, their murabaha sukuk, they can do. Murabaha is a profit disclosed sale, which creates a debt. Or if they want to do a lease-based transaction, which create debt eventually, because when you do a lease, you sell usufruct. So that's an obligation on you regardless of what you do. So it allows all these sort of instruments. So you should not say that. So that was definitely a wrong reading of it. There was another issue of asset backed and asset based and transfer of legal title, which I understand in the context of sovereign bodies, right? Most countries have limitation on selling international and sovereign assets. So for me, the first issue of IOFI pushback is that the reality is that on the both conventional and Islamic, like the selling and buying, it's conventional investors. And the initial readings of the standard were not really as accurate as it should be. And eventually there was some influence from the other big institutions that have pushed IOFI to put this back on consideration and revision. So I laugh sometimes when we think of these because I'm involved with IOFI in the standard process. So I remember once, maybe with Sheikh Farouk as well, we were laughing like when you issue a standard, it comes like a lion. It goes to the regulator, it comes like a tiger. It goes to the other market, it comes back as a cat. And then when you publish it, it becomes like a kitten. So it's unfortunately the influence because you don't want to issue standards that are not implementable, right? Something that can be accepted by the market. And it will take time. It will take time, inshallah.
But the thing is, Najib, is that to me, it seems as though people like to jump up and down about Islamic finance and how different it is. But then when you actually get to the reality of, you've got to actually take on risk, real risk on your balance sheet or off balance sheet rather, people then start to shy away from this. And then if you actually look at how the ecosystem, Islamic finance ecosystem actually works, it's not too dissimilar from the conventional in reality, despite all the legal and Sharia steps you're talking about. So isn't this just a case of like it's human nature? They don't really want to take on too much risk.
Yeah. I remember reading something interesting about this. In humans in general, we don't like taking risks. Risk is not something appealing to us, right? So look, you, me, everyone as humans. So when we put the target of Islamic finance, or we put one of the key features of Islamic finance as risk sharing, uh, it's not the best appeal. I remember Mufti Faraz has wrote something interesting about it and made me think about this more is, one of the verses in the Quran talks about money and we did not create money so it becomes in the hands of the few. And I think that is a very more important objective of Islamic finance to think about, which is the objective of Islamic finance should not be concentration of the money among the hands of few, meaning that you need to keep that money flowing in trade, in investments, in different types of activities. And if Islamic finance, like what we have in the UK, for example, most banks are focused on high net worth individuals. This is not serve the purpose of the real Islamic. We cannot say it's haram, but we are not saying they are achieving that purpose. So for me, I always focus on making sure money is being used in the economy, whether to facilitate trade. And if you think of the economy, the most used transaction is actually trade, Hassan. It's not profit sharing. I sell you an asset, you have to pay its price and create debt on you, right? So I'm not saying that risk sharing is something that Islamic finance should encourage. Yes, it does encourage. It's great. The reality is it's not always risk sharing. I probably would say risk participation, right? When you buy an asset, you have an asset risk, then you sell it. You no longer have an asset risk, you have more of a credit risk, right? So there is participation in that risk, but not as people perceive it always. Even think of home finance today. How can you risk share, Hassan? Like the main structures used in home finance is either you buy the house and sell it to the customer with a profit, right? So the only risk you're taking here is credit risk. But even the risk profile of credit risk is different than conventional finance. Because if the customer cannot pay on time under a sale transaction, you cannot increase the price. While this was a real issue when we had the COVID-19. The regulator has made it a requirement on all banks, including Islamic banks, to give the customers, a payment holiday if they ask for it. Now, when customers ask for a payment holiday and you have a diminishing musharaka and ijara, every month you have two installments, one to get a part in the house and one to pay for lease, right? So if you stop both because you give them a payment holiday, and when you want to roll out the product afterwards, the part where you pay, like where you buy a share in the house, that's fine. You can have more, in the conventional way, you can have more interest. You can charge more rent on it because you own a share in the house. But if you have outstanding debt, rent, which is not paid, is debt. You cannot charge rent on rent. It becomes interest. So banks panicked and they had to do some letter to customers and some of them have to look at their core banking system because that's a different genuine Sharia thing. And they have to segregate that amount, how much rent, and they have to talk to the customer. Can we use that money to reduce your share or can we, while the conventional banks didn't have a problem. Happy days. You can just keep compounding interest.
Do you think also the other issue with AOFI's Sharia Standard 62 is that a lot of people mention to me the enforceability of the standard? Which jurisdiction really takes AOFI as law? Is it only the UAE? And
Yeah.
it would lead to a lot of challenges like stamp duty, the cost of increase. It's really interesting you mentioned the point about credit rating agencies because I would have thought they would have liked something like this because it created extra work for them so they could charge more money. Whereas it's for the banks and the lawyers, it's like it could lead to fewer deals. But for the credit rating agencies, it doesn't really matter to them. They're just looking at the credit.
No, as far as I know, they have published like some negative impact about it, an estimation of negative impact, right? Because they eventually, it's right, you are right. It will not increase the work for them. It will decrease it, Hassan, because they have thought there will be less issuance. That means less work for us. But I'm not going to say this is their intention. We don't know, right? I'm just saying that they were of them the early ones who commented negatively about the impact of it and everyone listens to them because they are the one who does the credit rating where investors can invest based on that, right? So and the taxation issues are real, you are right, but this is why when we engage with countries, when we introduce sukuk, we make these changes in the first place. If you do not have these changes in the taxation, how on earth you started to do sukuk? Like one of the key things we start with is, labeling sukuk to be like an asset-backed or asset-based instrument. So I've been recently working on sukuk legislation in Africa, and that's one of the things we started. You have to enable that sukuk to do that, and you have to put this requirement of taxation neutrality that the second sale, for instance, whether it's sale, lease, whatever, it should not be subject to taxation. When it's sovereign sukuk, it's easy, to be honest with you. You can just get something from the Ministry of Finance, but when it's corporate sukuk, it's really the challenge. So for me, it's not the IOFI standard for taxation that has raised the issue. The issue has been there all the time because you should have created that enabling environment. We haven't talked much about creating that enabling ecosystem because conventional finance starts, the principle is money is something that you can give with excess, or with a discount. That's completely against conventional finance. So when I work with the government, I look at the definition of a bank, and you will see usually banks are excluded explicitly from doing trade, lease, buying assets, except for their own use. So when we do this, the first thing we say is we either change the definition of a bank and then add Islamic banking activities, or we have a new definition of an Islamic bank where we enable them to do this. So the system is designed completely against it. And then you have to go to taxation and resolve it. When you do murabaha, what type of taxation you will have, and you fix them. Like in the UK, when we started deposit products, right? People were used to be paid profit. The HMRC would look at profit as not interest and tax it differently. So you have a non-taxable allowance of interest of, let's say, 500 and 1,000. So they would consider that profit as taxable income, just like what I think you have for alternative products like FIDA, right? FIDA is an investment product, right? So they don't have the allowance of interest like Islamic banking deposits. So then there was changes in the legislation to introduce something called alternative finance income, which is not generated from interest. So now it's being given equal treatment to interest. That took years. The home purchase plans of buying a house, there is double stamp duty because we had to introduce a new definition, home purchase plan, in the FCA rulebook. And in the FCA rulebook, you will see it says that one of the conditions of the home purchase plan is for the bank to have a real interest in the asset. Right? It's not something cosmetic. Banks will be subject to real risks. For example, I know a bank, there was a structural damage in the property. So the customer has to leave the property. They had to fix it for 6 months. During the 6 months, they couldn't charge rent because they were not able, as an owner of a property, they were unable to give that. You are not just charging interest on a loan, you are charging rent on a property, and they were not able to use that property. So yes, I mean, again, I went back and forward around the question, but for IOFI Sukuk standard, even as you rightly mentioned, the enforceability issue, in most countries, IOFI is not even enforceable. Even in countries where they claim it's enforceable, there's a lot of interpretations of IOFI standards. It's easy to interpret IOFI standards the way you like because in most cases, sometimes they don't give like a strict yes or no. So I don't think it was 100% over exaggerated, the impact of the standard 62. And I don't think it would have had the impact that it was perceived, especially with very few countries considering IOFI as a legal or regulatory requirement. And there was a room, even within the standard itself, there was a lot of room for a leeway. In some cases, they will clearly mention that if the regulations do not allow this for a sovereign, then that is fine. But it
The
happened, and let's see what happens with the
yeah,
new version of it.
the other point I was going to say is that you mentioned earlier on about involvement of the banks, and unfortunately, well, for better or worse, majority of sukuk buyers are banks, Islamic banks, managing their
Yes,
liquidity. That's
yes.
kind of you need to
So if you
develop
think of
ecosystem.
absolutely. If you look on the both sides of the equation, you will see, the big names of the banks on both sides contributing into this. So, and I think most of them, when they have seen the analysis of the credit rating institutions, they will largely be influenced by that because this is how bankers think. If the credit rating is saying this is going to affect the market, then it will affect the market.
I think probably I've always said this to people within AOFI as well, that it's probably better to develop the asset-backed security market within the region or within OIC countries, and then introduce something like AOFI Sharia Standard 62 rather than just try and shock the market in this sense. Do you think it's probably better doing something like that where you gradually build up and then you get to where you want to be?
Hassan, we have today asset-backed sukuk. In the markets, we have I think 5 or 10% where you have asset-backed real asset ownership. And by the way, people get so much fixated about asset-backed. Depending on the structure, it might be a useless name. Like if you are doing murabaha, you buy an asset, you own it for a day, but then you sell it. What is the point? Asset-backed is only beneficial with things like lease, ijara, for example. The main trigger, what happens is, in case of default, your asset is segregated from the rest of the obligor responsibilities. So imagine if, God forbid, a government defaults on payment of sukuk. You don't stand if it's asset backed, you don't stand in the queue waiting for your money to be paid after paying everyone else. You have an asset that you own by your SPV. You can sell it independently, and get your money. That's the main feature really of the asset backed sukuk. But there's also other features like about, the profit has to be related to that asset performance. The losses has to be based on that asset performance. But the reality is when you have a property, you would not make a loss unless you sell it. So most of the lease back like lease type assets, Sukuk, their only risk they run is credit risk. And with governments, it's very unlikely for a government to default in that manner. I mean, for profit sharing, like partnership, like Musharaka Sukuk, asset backed doesn't mean a lot because in most cases they will use it in certain projects where you cannot really, own it as a legal title. It's just about the performance, the legal performance. So even the terminology is overplayed. I think the only way asset-backed sukuk will be looked at seriously. If the conventional side do something similar, it picks up, then we copy it. Because now the conventional guys are used to seeing it in the conventional way. They will accept it in the Islamic way. So there is always a cost for having conventional institutions involved in Islamic. They will help you in outreach. They will help you in scale. They will help you in getting systemic importance, but they will also be resistant to change because they are used of doing certain things in certain ways. So Islamic finance always has to do that option. You establish a new full-fledged bank in the UK, for example, Islamic Bank of Britain. Their cost was very high, difficult to start. HSBC Amana comes, issues, Sharia compliant home purchase plans with 1% deposit. How can it's good for the community, right? They got home purchase plans for 1%, but at the same time, Islamic Bank of Britain was not able to cope up. Then when these guys left, there was some market for them to go in. They got the capital, they strengthened their balance sheet. So there's always a trade-off.
What's the best way people can reach you, Najib?
I think LinkedIn probably is the best way if they want to reach out, inshallah. Najib Al Aswad in LinkedIn.
And are you active on other social media or is it just LinkedIn?
To be honest with you, a couple of years ago, I have done some social medias. They have some couple of guys helping me. We set up a YouTube channel, an Instagram page, a TikTok, and Facebook, and we were recording some videos in Arabic on YouTube as well. It picked up very well. We had like a couple of thousand subscribers in 6 months, but I found it very intensive, time intensive to do the video recording in particular. So yes, I have accounts on social media, other accounts like Instagram and others, but I rarely use them. As of today, I'm focused on LinkedIn. Maybe things will change in the future.
I'll link it in the show notes. But Najib Al Aswad, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate your insights and, mashallah, your knowledge as well. And
Inshallah, Jazakallah khair. And thank you very much for inviting me. I honestly felt like I'm sitting with you and chit-chatting. So knowing you personally and doing all the good work you're doing, may Allah reward you abundantly. You've been writing about and researching and putting very good thought leadership pieces in Islamic finance. So may
thank
Allah
you.
reward you abundantly, grant you success. And I hope to see you going at different places, inshallah, in the industry and beyond.
Inshallah. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.